What is up, you guys? Thank you for joining me today for another episode. I'm happy to have you here with me. Today, we are talking all about stress. I wanted to do this episode because I think that stress is kind of misunderstood in our culture quite a bit. I think that most of us carry around some low level of chronic stress, and it may not even be identifiable because we walk around with stress so much. Our baseline for stress is so high, so we don't know what it feels like to not be stressed sometimes. In this episode, I talk about basically the way that stress can manifest, and this is your call to action. This is your call to do something about your stress, because when it manifests, it's always going to be in an undesirable way. Then I talk about 4 silent contributors to stress that you may never have even considered. Those contributors being your story, what you're telling yourself about your stress, physical discomfort, or wearing things that are, too tight, or being sleep deprived. And then we talk about your stuff as a contributor of stress when we have too much, when things are too cluttered, we can't think clearly, and then a lack of autonomy. AKA, do you have control of your own life, or does somebody else control it for you? Do your finances control it for you? Have you given it out to somebody or something else outside of you? Of course, I couldn't do this episode without leaving you with some things about what to do, so that's what we ended on. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. So without further ado, welcome to the Get Out of Your Head podcast, where we talk all about the stories that keep you stuck, blocked from manifesting what you really want, and away from your authentic life. I am your host, Sarah, from Spirit, Mind, Body. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you for joining me today. If you are new, welcome. If you are returning, thank you for coming back. Today, I'm talking all about stress. I wanted to do this episode on stress because in our culture, we have a very specific idea of what stress looks like, and it's really so much more than that. Stress turns us into our worst versions of ourselves. It throws us into our programming. It makes us do things that we're really not proud of, that we really don't want to do. It derails us from our plan, our authentic life. And it looks like a different version than we typically envision. I'm sure you can probably remember on some corporate PowerPoint or a TED Talk, I have this vision in my mind of a woman who is stressed out, and what it looks like is overwhelmed. Maybe she has piling papers at work. She's probably pulling out her hair, or some version of she's just in distress. She's probably frustrated, and you probably wouldn't be surprised to learn that her hair is falling out. She doesn't sleep well. Maybe she's suffering some kind of weight issue, gain, loss. And that's the essential picture of stress. The deal is that it is so much more than that, and we're going to get into that. Today, I wanted just to give you a quick intro, and then we're going to talk about how stress manifests and how it's progressive, and then we're going to talk about, 4 different things. I just picked 4. There's so many, but there are 4 different versions of stress that you might be overlooking, or things that are really undetected. And then we just end with, what could you do about it? What can you do to kind of mitigate some of the stress in your life when you are feeling it? So again, I wanted to do this episode because when you're stressed, you become the worst version of yourself. You probably are going to lash out on the people that you love. You become short-tempered. You slip into mental judgment. You're kind of like nitpicking at other people. You're getting really self-critical. You give into your unhealthy habits that you really want to stop doing, like eating, watching too much late night TV, drinking, or whatever your vice is. And I've talked about this before, but my theory is that stress puts us squarely into programmed responses. And by programmed responses, I mean the responses you learned when you were a kid to manage stress. As a short recap, you could probably go back and revisit my first episode that I ever did, and I talk about stress a bit, and I talk about authenticity. But As a short recap, my theory, and I don't have like hard evidence to support it, but it just makes sense to me. But my theory is that when we're stressed, we have hormones that course through our system that tell us to fight or flight. That means take care of the emergency matter at hand and do not worry about anything else. While conscious thought is actually very expensive to run energetically, and subconscious thought is very inexpensive to run. And so that's a good thing survivalistically, because if you're running from a lion, you don't have time to look and plan out, and you really have to react, and that's where the subconscious comes in. Our conscious thought is planning. It looks at all different situations. It picks the best possible. But the problem is that in our day and age right now, we are very rarely faced with a lion, but biologically we do think that we are faced with a lion. So your subconscious is formed when you were really little. It's all of the things that you learned about the way that the world works. This is written into your history. And so to bring it back to what we're talking about, you might have learned to deal with stress because the way that you watched your mother yell and take things out on your dad becomes like an observation that you have internalized. And so now when you're stressed, you yell and take it out on your spouse. It could manifest like that. You might have learned how to deal with stress experientially, that the world around you is pretty much out of your control. And so you adapted by being maybe a perfectionist. And so you told yourself the story that if you just were perfect, if you just got good enough grades, if you were just the track all-star, if you did everything perfectly, then somehow, you could stop your parents from fighting, or something else that was out of your control. You might have learned that identifying imperfections in others or being hypercritical takes the focus off of you and any faults that you might have. And so when you're stressed, your programmed response could be to judge others for the things that you might be really ashamed to admit. I see versions of all of these in myself, and maybe you do too. The way that we deal with stress is largely what we experienced as we were younger, written into our history, written into the way that we learned. It's experiential. And it worked for us for a long time, but the question is it still working for us? And I'm gonna guess it's not. I'm gonna guess that your stress response, the way that you have learned to deal with stress, whether that's being your perfectionist, whether that's your inner critic just is overloaded and starts spewing it out on other people, even if your inner critic is inward directed, whether you play the victim, whether you take it out on somebody you love, all of those things are the way that we've learned to deal with stress, but they're not healthy. They're not giving us the relationships that we want. They're not giving us the life that we want. When we talk about hurt people, most of the time, those hurt people are just suffering a lot of chronic stress, and then they pass it on to others just as unconscious reactions. And so when we talk about healing, part of that is knowing your stress triggers and how to deal with them appropriately and healthfully. And so this is why it's really important for me to have this episode and to talk about the stress, because I want you to know that stress can come from a variety of different places in your life. It can manifest as a lot of different things. And here's kind of my theory is that if you know your stress triggers, if you know what it takes to balance you, and you identify, okay, I'm doing this thing that I don't really want to be doing, then perhaps you can come back to what am I actually stressed out about? Because the large majority of the time it's misdirected. I get stressed, I start to yell at my kids, I start to take it out on my spouse, and it's not their fault. It's a product of me getting poor sleep. It's a product of me having an unclean house. It's a product of me being overwhelmed at work or feeling like I can't handle things. And that's really the root cause. But if I'm not in touch with that, and if I don't know what my stress triggers are, and if I can't identify and articulate that I am actually really stressed out, then it's going to seem like my husband is to blame, like my kids are actually the problem, and really they're not. And so it focuses the stress back on where it's supposed to be. So let's talk about how stress manifests in so many different ways and how it progresses. So there's three ways that I think that it manifests. First off, it's going to show up as bodily sensations. Then it's going to show up as your programming. And then it's going to, if it goes on for too long, it's going to get internalized. And there's a lot of good research out there that shows that maybe it could become a physical illness. So let's just go through these real quick. The first thing, it's going to show up as bodily sensations. And this is what I want you to do. Start journaling how your body feels when you're stressed. And actually, I don't think it's super helpful to call it stressed. I would call it more like it's feeling off. Whenever you're in a bad mood, there's probably some stress hormone that's coursing through your system, and you just need to figure out what that feels like in your body. Your body will always tell you when something is off. It might be your back starts to get really tight in your upper back, right? It might be a tightness in your chest. It could be a panicky feeling or an inability to sleep. Your voice could start get shaking. You could feel like crying. You could start getting super analytical and, hypercritical of other people. You could get sick to your stomach. For me, it feels like my awareness all goes to my head, and then all of a sudden my external world starts closing in on myself. I get really, really wrapped up in what's in my head, and I have a hard time placing my focus on something else outside of me, whether that's just my environment, whether it's people. I have a hard time empathizing with people when I'm in this stress state. And it was only through years of observation that I realized that I was doing this. And now, when I go to that place, when I know that my awareness is going to my head and everything kind of feels like it's closing in, I know that I don't trust my thoughts in that space, because my thoughts are coming from a programmed response, and that's not my higher self. And so my programmed response is going to be something like, your husband doesn't do enough housework. It's not fair that you get stuck with the kids all the time. It's not fair that you have to take care of this. It's not fair that you have all of these responsibilities. And I start to become the victim. And because I don't like really being the victim, that seems disempowering to my conscious mind. Then what I will do is I will start being the critic. And I'll start criticizing everyone and every little thing around me. And that could even be the way that somebody talked to me at the grocery store. That could be the way somebody cut me off in traffic, whatever it is. All that to say, though, that's me. And I know that when I'm in that state, when my body starts to feel that way, that I don't trust what I have going on in my head. I know I have to work through it. And I'm not saying that there's not a grain of truth. There usually is. There usually is a grain of truth in whatever I'm thinking, but I can't go off of that as the absolute truth, right? I don't see any other options at that time. This is why, I started even talking about ego stories, because I realized this was happening. And it was really helpful for me to realize when it was happening, and then to not pick fights with my spouse. Mostly that's the reason that it starts happening. But then also it starts to, domino into my actual life, and the way that I talk to my kids, and the way that I'm allowed to get myself breaks, and the way I talk to even my coworkers. When I'm in that space where I'm hypercritical, I know just to kind of keep to myself for a while, because I don't want to hurt anybody else in the process. And I know also that I need to start to be vulnerable and to ask for help. And I'll get into that a little bit later. So, secondly, stress manifests as it starts to show up in your programming. And again, that kind of relates to the last point, right? They sort of go hand in hand. I know my body starts to do this thing where my awareness goes to my head, everything kind of closes in, and then I start doing the programming thing, which is basically me playing the victim and then the inner critic. So this can come out in so many different ways. We kind of talked about it before, but it could show up as you being a perfectionist, where you have to have every single little thing in order. You make all these lists, and then you're like, nothing will be perfect enough. Your programmed response could be yelling. It could be yelling at the people that are closest to you. Your programmed response could be gossiping. It could be becoming really hypercritical or nitpicking, or doing some kind of controlling behavior where you try to control everybody else around you and your environment, and not necessarily yourself. It could be burying yourself in your work and just trying to forget about it. It could be gossiping. It could be telling yourself a story. It could be giving into a vice or some kind of addiction of some sort. And I just wanted to pause here and kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent. But the thing is that our addictions, whatever that looks like for you, because we all have them, What I really mean by addiction is some kind of thing that you rely on to bring you external comfort that probably isn't all that healthy. If your addiction is socially sanctioned, it probably looks like binging on a TV show. It could look like food. It could look like shopping. It could look like social media, and it might look like alcohol. I think those are the big ones. Those are the big ones that I think that our society kind of overlooks as problems. And here's the thing, if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. It's a problem if it presents a problem for you. So if you look at yourself and you say, honestly, I'm being honest with myself here, I have an unhealthy relationship with food, and I use food to bring me comfort in times where I really should be paying attention to myself, where I really should be focused on healing, and instead I use food to escape, then that's a problem for you. But if you don't feel like you have a problem with that, then it's determined by you. But the thing is that your addiction, if it's unhealthy, it's going to lead to more stress, and then it becomes a cycle. And so this is the way it works. Let's just take the classic stress example. So you're overwhelmed, you're stressed at work, you come home from work, you tell yourself a story, you say, I deserve a drink because I was really stressed at work, or I deserve this food, or I deserve to sit and kick my feet up and unplug my brain and watch TV. And then you give into your vice, or whatever that thing is, that comfort, that thing that's going to bring you a bit of comfort. And then you go overboard if it's an addiction. And so you're going to stay up way too late watching TV. You're going to spend way too much money online if it's shopping. You are going to drink too much if it's alcohol. And so then the next day, you're going to either be hungover, or your financial stress is going to come back because you spent too much money online, or you are going to be suffering lack of sleep. And so then that sets you up for the next day being stressed out even more because lack of sleep, financial stress, eating too much, even feeling like bodily sensations, feeling like shit is going to contribute to you being stressed, or even being hungover is going to contribute to stress, right? And so that creates more stress, and then you're not able to deal with more overwhelm at work. And so then that's where the cycle starts going. And so I call it an addiction because it fuels itself. Does that make sense? And the way to see this is that I think that there's this common thought of like, you deserve your unhealthy habit. And I'm going to talk about this next week when we talk about self-care a bit. But the thing is that when we tell ourselves that story, you deserve your unhealthy habit, you're not setting yourself up for success. It's not taking care of yourself. You're abandoning yourself in that moment. And so if it's, like I said, if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. If it's not contributing to more stress, then don't feel bad about it. But if you can look at yourself honestly and say, yeah, you know what? I guess I watch too much TV and it's really distracting me, because what I really want to do is go to bed early and get a good night of sleep so that I can wake up tomorrow and handle the things at hand that I need to do. But you're not able to do that because one episode leads to the next, and then all of a sudden you find yourself turning off the TV at 2 or 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is. Then that's where it becomes a problem. Okay, so all that to say that stress can manifest as addiction if that's part of your programming. All of us have addictions. Take a minute to recognize right now, what is your vice? What is the thing that you go to when you're feeling overwhelmed, imbalanced, frustrated, whatever it is? Even just today, I've been feeling really overwhelmed at work, to be honest. And I looked at my closet and I said to myself, oh, you know what? I deserve a new shirt. Or I deserve to not even think about that. And I start to tell myself, well, that doesn't really meet your financial goals, but who cares? I'll make up for it next month. That's the story that goes on. It's not healthy. It's not helpful. It's better to recognize the story and say to myself, well, you know what? I am stressed, and a shirt's not going to make it better. And then do something, helpful for yourself instead of abandoning yourself or making your stress worse. Okay, the third thing for how stress manifests is that it can start to become physical illness if it's internalized for too long. There's an amazing book called When the Body Says No, or maybe it's just The Body Says No, by Gabor Mate. He's a psychiatrist, and he talks to patients with chronic disease. And so these chronic diseases are things like cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, ALS, Alzheimer's, and many, many more. There's a common thread between the people who have this disease and their internalized stress. Having not spoken up for years, having tried to please people around them for so long. And his theory, and I guess there's a bit of research on this, is that internalized stress is going to start to eat away at the body. Say you're like, I don't really have any like unhealthy habits. I don't really spew my hurt onto other people when I'm stressed. I just internalize it and I take care of it myself. Well, here's the thing is that if it goes on for too long, possibly that that energy has to go somewhere. And if it's not outward directed, it is possible that it could be inward directed. Don't get me wrong here. Like, I'm not saying that, okay, you don't want to cause yourself to get some kind of disease or some kind of illness, and so you should go ahead and yell at other people. It seems like in this case that there's not really a good solution, but I do think that self-care and healing are viable solutions that have been overlooked for so long. And so we're going to talk about that. We'll get into that. And again, I'm talking about self-care next week, so stay tuned for that episode if that is something, if you're like, wow, I really identify with this and I need some better solutions, that is a really good one. So either way, however you look at it, stress going on for too long is not a good thing. We end up either hurting other people or the people that are around us because we don't know how to manage it, and it feels a little bit better in the moment to subconsciously bring people to our level. It makes us feel a little bit better. Or we turn it inwards and deteriorate our own bodies, or it looks like addiction, right? Like, there's so many different ways that this manifests, and stress, unmanaged stress, will manifest in unhealthy ways almost any way you turn it. So that is why identifying stress in my life has been a game changer for me. Identifying stress has drastically improved my quality of relationships, both with my partner, my kids, my parents, my coworkers, my friends, everyone, and my life on the whole. I think that, if you can adequately and clearly identify your own stress, it is a game changer, because you start to say, I feel this way, instead of saying, this is your fault. Do you see the difference? It's starting to realize, okay, well, the root of the problem is actually something different than initially I tell myself what it is. So I've gotten really curious about this. I've started to look at all of the things that could possibly throw me into a stress response. And then I started talking to other people and kind of gathering some information as well. What I've learned, though, is that stress shows up in so many different ways. And knowing the way that it shows up for you and what are the things that clearly tip you off balance will help you both identify the root cause of the problem, right? Because if you're telling yourself that it's somebody else's, like if you're telling yourself that the problem to your stress is your spouse and it's not actually your spouse, then your spouse is getting the brunt of the stress, is getting all sorts of anger or blame that they're not actually responsible for. And not to mention that even if they change, it's not going to fix your problem if it's not the root cause. So I figured we'd take some time, and I just picked 4. There's so many. Actually, I have written down probably at least 21 or so, but these are just the most common ones that I see that I think that maybe we could all benefit from. So I wanted to give you a different vision of stress than just the overwhelmed corporate woman that has stacks of paper behind her that she's buried in work. That could be stress, but it also could be so many different things. So the first thing I have is your story. This is the internal chatter in your mind, and it's actually going to cause you more stress because you're putting yourself on the defense. You're making a situation where it's them versus me, and the reality is that the other is actually someone who's probably on your side, right? This is certainly my experience. I would take almost everything out of my husband instead of just asking for what I wanted or what I needed, and that puts him on the defense. I would say, it's your fault, you're to blame because you didn't vacuum, because you didn't do the dishes, whatever it is. And I would criticize him for not knowing what I needed and giving it to me when I didn't even know what I needed. And this is how confusing stories get. It's so misguided. When you're in a story, you have all of these things going on in your head, but then it's not that clear. It's very cloudy. And so when you're feeling confusion, you're almost certainly in a story. Confusion is a manifestation of the inner reality, which is your belief, and an outer reality mismatch. In this example, my unconscious beliefs were that my partner should know me better than I know myself. My partner should have the same priorities that I do. He should vacuum the floor. He should want to do the dishes. Or that my partner has not met my needs. In other words, I'm feeling upset and clearly he's walking around not meeting my needs, and therefore he doesn't love me or care about me. Your story is going to be created based on your underlying beliefs. And so it's a really good idea to do a deep dive of what those underlying beliefs are, possibly where they came from, although that's not really, they came from your past, your history. You created these when you were younger. It's the way that you viewed the world, but sometimes these underlying beliefs, A, are subconscious, you don't even know you have them, and B, they're misguided. They're not true. If I have a belief my spouse should know me better than I know myself, well, that's not really realistic. And so it's an opportunity to reevaluate those beliefs and take on new beliefs when they don't serve you anymore. Do you get what I mean? So your story can take on a variety of tones. And I have 3 here that, are pretty pervasive. I think that they come up a lot. I did a whole podcast episode about the inner victim. Think about this as they're very archetypal. So just think about a victim and how a victim would talk to you. And that's usually this voice that starts to show up and starts to write your stories for you. So I'll just give you a really quick overview of all of these. I haven't done one on the critic or the saboteur, although it's kind of in my plans at some point. I'll do one. But if you wanted to listen to more about the inner victim, you could go back and listen to that episode. I'll link it in the show notes below. But the inner victim is based in powerlessness or a hopelessness to change something. It's the illusion that by playing the part of a victim, it's actually a way to give you a sense of control back, right? Because if I'm standing on the side of right, then someone else or something else is standing on the side of wrong. And so you justify it by saying this universal principle of fairness has not been met. And so therefore I am right? Because I've been victimized. It's a way to flip the script in the power situation so that the offender or whatever it is now powerless while you become powerful, even though you're the victim, right? But in this story, you always are going to remain powerless. The assumption of the victim is that it was somebody else's fault and it's their responsibility to change it. And so therefore I can't do much to change it, and they have to do it in order to change. And the power comes from the fact that there's a universal or there's a moral principle that you have been wronged, and so you sit on that side. And so your power is really in this external idea of what right is. It's not within, it's hinging, it's attached to the idea of what was morally right. Okay, so I'm just telling you these things though, so that you can identify when you start doing it. I always know, when I'm in the victim, I know what I'm doing. It's just this awareness. And so when you can have awareness, you stop really believing it. That's really where it becomes empowering. It's okay, now I see it not as me, but I see this as a voice or a thought that I have instead. Do you see the difference? All right, so the next one I have is the critic. The critic is based in worthlessness or shame or not living up to your potential. There's this great quote that says, "Those who can do, those who can't judge." So wherever you may be judging can be a call to your most authentic life. I would do this a lot when I was, wanting to start my business or my podcast and I wasn't really there. I would take other people's podcasts and I'd be like, oh my gosh, look at how terrible that was. Or I'd look at other people's social media or their business strategy and I would just judge the shit out of it because I was so insecure in myself. And not to mention, that was something that was for me that I was not tapping into yet. That was a reflection of me because I hadn't done it. And so it feels a lot better, instead of admitting, well, I haven't lived up to my potential. It feels a lot better just to judge somebody and say, oh, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. As a side note, if you're the product of somebody else's judgment, just know that. Just know that it's probably rooted in a feeling of insecurity or a feeling of I haven't lived up to my potential, and so it's easier for me to judge you than to actually do it myself, because doing it yourself actually takes work. And if you find yourself as the inner critic, that thing is probably for you. You need to start asking questions and say, okay, well, where am I not living up to my potential? Where is this thing for me and I haven't stepped up to the plate? Okay, the third one is the saboteur. The underlying emotion for the saboteur is an undermined feeling or feeling like a lack of control. But instead of trying to wiggle your way out of it, you sort of just settle in. It's this acceptance, but it's not like the good kind of acceptance where you accept all that is. You accept that this is all there could be. You accept this as your reality, and so you just try to make yourself as comfortable as you can in the process. Usually the saboteur comes with a lot of addictive type of attachments. These are where your vices are going to show up. This is where you'll tell yourself a story around the saboteur of like, well, I just couldn't do it because I wasn't good enough, or I wasn't meant for that, or whatever. Those are the stories of your saboteur. Your saboteur is the one that's going to undermine whatever you're trying to do because you sort of settled into an acceptance. Does that make sense? And so all that to say that just getting really curious about your thoughts and recognizing these archetypal voices as they come up, and then questioning your beliefs are really what's going to get you through this story type of situation. Also, listen to my podcast, listen to more of my podcast. This is what I talk about. Everything I talk about is really it's really geared towards helping you uncover these subconscious stories. I think stories are the number one thing that's going to contribute to your stress. And it's so easy to overlook, right? Because our stories feel so real. Okay, the next silent contributor to stress that I have for you is physical discomfort. This is the twinge in your neck that won't go away, your clothes being too tight, not being confident in what you're wearing, feeling bloated, tired, dirty, etc. This is so basic, yet we overlook this all the time. Sometimes our physical discomfort can even send us into a story too, right? If I'm wearing clothes that are too tight for me, that cut my body off in weird places and are really uncomfortable, don't make me feel confident, then that can also drive a story that says something about my weight, which is a huge shame trigger for most people. This is why it's especially important to take care of your body. Take time to warm up and cool down from your workout. Stretch. Take some ibuprofen if you need it. As a side note, for the longest time, I was like a person who was like, no medicine, no medicine, no medicine. And as a single, non-parent, I was able to do that. And then I became a parent and I have a lot of stress now. I have a lot of things that contribute to my stress every single day. And so it's important for me just to recognize, okay, well, you know what? I don't need to be a hero in this moment. And I'm constantly asking myself, do I really need it? And if I need it, I take it. You know what I mean? That's for a lot of us. I used to do the same thing with cold medicine. And obviously the best thing to do is to take care of your body so you don't get sick, to increase your immunity. But if you are in a place where you just can't deal with it, you don't have it, you can take something and make yourself physically comfortable so that that's not contributing to your stress anymore. Eat foods that don't make you feel bloated. Get adequate sleep. Love your body, and buy yourself clothes that fit you instead of holding out for one day when you'll be able to wear that. Don't keep those clothes in your closet. I'm going to talk about this in just a second, but not only does that cloud your perception of what you have to wear, but it also makes you feel guilty for not being like that. And the truth is that when you get down to that weight at one point in your life, whenever that is, you're going to want new clothes anyway. You don't want your old clothes. So give it away. Respect your body. Give your body good things to wear. Give your body the space to breathe that it needs. I enjoy intermittent fasting. That's another thing, or these crazy diets. And I think that it's really helpful to do like a 30-day challenge at one point or something like that. I think that's great. But if that is bringing you more stress, it's time to ask, what am I feeling uncomfortable because I've been fasting all day and all of a sudden I'm not allowing myself to give myself food or nourishment that I need at this moment. Okay, the third one is your stuff. We collectively as a society have way too much stuff. We are not able to find our stuff. Most of us can't manage the things that we have. I would say that I've done a good amount of decluttering in my house, and I still have too much stuff. Your stuff contributes to your stress on so many levels, and here's how. 1, it takes you forever to find things because you misplaced them in a pile of clutter. 2, clutter clouds our minds, so we can't think straight when there's shit everywhere and your environment is messy. It's chaotic. It's not peaceful. You want to sit down, read a book, and all you can see is junk on the floor or out of place. 3, we have to mentally keep track of all of the things that we don't have the capacity for. We are worrying about protecting our stuff. Like, what if somebody steals it? What if somebody breaks it? What if something happens to it? There's so much underlying stress that comes with having a lot of valuable stuff. I'll just tell you a really quick story. I used to have this big Mac computer. It was just, it was a desktop, and I paid a lot of money for it. And I realized that, first off, I didn't really use it that much. I use my laptop because I travel a lot and I'm constantly with kids in different rooms and stuff like that. And so I'm using my laptop more and more. And I realized that by having this big ass computer, I'm not able to do things, I'm not able to Airbnb my house out because what if somebody used it and breaked it? Then it was just contributing to my stress even more. And so the best thing to do is chalk it up to, okay, well, I bought it, I didn't use it, and now it is holding space in my house, and it's holding mental space because I don't have the capacity for certain things. I have to remember, what did I put my stuff on? Did I write that on that computer? Did I do this on this computer? Do I have to transfer files? There were so many things that just weren't worth it, and that's really the point of that. You have to mentally keep track of things that you don't have the ability to keep track of. And then you have to guard your possessions because you have too much stuff. Okay, that was a really long tangent. Number 4 is decision fatigue. What outfit do I wear? What project should I be working on? What book should I read? What should I do? What should I eat? What tends to happen when we have too many choices is that we're not actually satisfied with any of them. We end up choosing one thing, then our minds are mentally on something else that is equally as good of a choice, but we convince ourselves that we'd be happier with the other choice. That is stressful. For example, I have 27 dresses that I need to choose from for an event, and I'm between 5 of them, and I finally go with one, and then I go to the event, and then I see somebody else who has a different dress that reminded me of the other dress that was a close second, and so I'm thinking to myself, oh, I should have worn this dress instead of this dress, right? That's just an example, but we do that all the time, that decision fatigue. I'm watching this, but maybe I should be watching something else. Maybe I should be reading something else. Maybe I should be listening to something else. That's the point. It's decision fatigue. That is very stressful for us. Okay, the 5th way that your stuff stresses you out is your finances. When you can't keep track of your stuff, you end up buying things because you forgot where you put them. I can't tell you how many times this has happened to me. We're like, okay, we're going to save this in the odd chance that maybe we'll need an extra spatula one day. And then come that time when I need an extra spatula, I can't find it anyway because it's in all my stuff. And so I end up buying another one. In the days of Amazon Prime, you can get something depending on where you live, probably 24 hours, maybe even less. And not to mention that it's not that big of a deal to go. Like, maybe you could even get creative in that way. Back to the topic, but you can't see what you have because you aren't mentally able to keep track of that much stuff. And so you end up buying other things. And not to mention that even if you do have something that you remember, especially this happens with our clothes a lot, we look at our closets and we're like, I have nothing to wear. I'm so over it. And so you go out and buy new things anyway. Not because you don't have anything, but because you're dissatisfied with what you have. And so if it's done too many times, you end up wasting your money on things that, you buy a new shirt, it hangs in your closet with the tags on and you never wear it. And that leads to financial stress as well. Financial stress builds up. Obviously, that contributes to our overall stress as well. Okay, the 4th thing I have and the last major contributor to stress that I see is a lack of autonomy. Do you own your life or does your life own you? That's the point of this one. Being around people or situations that make you feel powerless is what I mean. So Johann Hari talks about this in his book called Lost Connections. I would really recommend it, but he gives this imagery of a person who goes to work, mixes paint, sells it to somebody, goes back to work, repeat over and over and over again. I know certainly this was my life a few years ago when I felt like I went to work, I did a meaningless job, I went home, I did it all again. And my life was on one big, underwhelming, purposeless repeat. When your life force and all of your energy is being handed over to a job that is either meaningless to you or you have little say over your time or how things go in general, that becomes a huge contributor of underlying chronic stress. This lack of autonomy can come from a job like we just talked about. It could come from a boss that's really, really micromanaging. It could come from a friend who takes more from you than she gives. It could even come from your mom or your dad or your sibling, wherever. Sometimes it comes from people, sometimes it comes from situations. But ask yourself, who is silently manipulating you into doing their bidding for them? That is a very stressful situation when you are doing something for other people with zero payout in return. In what situations do you feel like you don't have a voice, like you're somebody else's pawn? You're not able to be yourself. You have to wear a mask or sort of be a certain way so that they accept you. Where do you feel like you have a lack of real contribution or you have a sense of purposelessness? That is where you're going to find your lack of autonomy. And the way out of this one is to first be really, really honest with yourself about how you really feel and then start to take your power back. Taking your power back can look like setting boundaries. It can look like speaking up. It can look like journaling. It can even look like just coming to terms with the problem, just being honest straight up about it. Because when you are aware of your problem, and you're honest about it, then that can start to bring you a sense of empowerment and real control back to you, as opposed to the fake control where you sort of try to control your environment or other people, or you try to do things that are actually not within your control, but it gives you that illusion of control. No, I'm talking about the real control where you start to say, that job is not worth it for me. I need to start applying for new ones, or that person is a really toxic person, and when they're starting to talk like that, I cannot have them in my life. Those are the kinds of control things that I'm talking about that make a really big difference and give the power back to you. Okay, so of course I can't end this episode without talking about, what do you do when you feel out of control? What do you do when you feel very, very stressed? And so I have 3 things. Obviously, this is not a catch-all list, but there are 3 things that really just came to mind as sort of really, really important. So first off, come back to your self-care practice. If you don't have a self-care practice, you have to start one. You have to start to realize, what does self-care look like to you? This is the way that you love yourself. This is the way that you mother yourself. Next week, I'm talking all about self-care, so stay tuned for that. Self-care is all about doing what actually fills you. The second thing is be vulnerable. First, be vulnerable with yourself. Keep asking questions until everything comes back to you. Ask yourself, what is it about this situation that frustrates me? What is it about this situation that makes me uneasy? And keep asking yourself these questions until they point somewhere back to you, because what your brain will do is you'll say, what is this about the situation that is so frustrating to me? And your mind will come up with stories. The stories are going to be like, my boss is a dick. He never listens to me. He demands perfection. She is extremely unreasonable in her requests. And all of those are stories, but when it comes back to you, what it's going to look like is, I'm overwhelmed. This makes me feel powerless. This makes me feel insignificant. This makes me feel like I'm not contributing. All of those things, like, keep asking that questions until you come back to a place of what you feel. And then share that truth with someone who can help. This could be a partner. It could be your friend. It could be your mom. It could be whoever is in your inner circle of people that really want to help you. Share that truth with somebody else, and your truth is going to be that honesty that you came back to, that pointed back to you. Truth looks like, this is how I feel, this is my history. Your truth is not, I need you to be different. I need you to do something different for me. I need this problem to go away. You may think that, but actually that's a story. Your truth is always something that points back to you. We underestimate the degree to which we need other people, but often when we're stressed, the way that it comes out is so misdirected, and the most effective way of reducing stress is to get empathy from others, to connect with others, either by feeling like you're not alone in your suffering, or by knowing that you're not alone in fixing it, knowing that you have help, knowing that you have people behind you to support you, to build you up, to help you out of your low point. But really, to experience that, you have to take that first step, and it's scary, and it's probably going to be out of faith, but you got to get vulnerable. You have to say something like, I feel inadequate, I feel scared, I feel worthless, I feel out of control, I'm spiraling, whatever that looks like for you. That's what you share. Brene Brown says, share that with the person who has earned the right to hear your story, and make sure that that person has your best interest in mind. It's not just anybody. Okay. The last thing is healing, and can be a whole nother episode in itself, but healing involves sending your former self love and nurturance and the space that it needs to honor all of the unpleasantness of the past and all of the ways that it showed up in your life to date. When you do this, you move through your traumas rather than getting stuck, right? When we experience trauma, what happens is we start to store it in our bodies. It starts to be this, you're going through your life, you're going through your story, and then all of a sudden something crazy happens and you don't know how to process it until you just stop right there. And so trauma will start playing out in different ways. Trauma will get stuck in the body, and it prevents you from progress, from moving forward in the way that you want to. So really powerful tools for healing. My favorite is shadow work, of course. That's my preference. Breath work can be a really good way to work through traumas. You can also journal. And then if it's more than that, you should go to therapy, actually, for some of these things. Work with a professional, right? There are so many methods, and it's really what works for you specifically. Working through healing is the best thing you can do for yourself, for every single person in your life. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope that you have a little bit clearer of a sense, like, stress is not just a certain thing. It's not just feeling overwhelmed. Yes, that's part of stress, but it's also all the other things. Feeling discomfort, feeling like you're out of control, having too much stuff, telling yourself a story that's mismatched with reality. That all of those things, and there's so many more, but all of those things contribute to your stress in such a low grade way, and it is cumulative. It starts compounding and compiling, and all of a sudden it's chronic and it's a problem. The best thing that you can do is to bring some awareness to this. Start a journaling practice. Start writing down, what does it feel like in your body? Start asking yourself, what are my triggers? What do I know is for sure going to make me stressed? Get a self-care practice. Start figuring out, what are my go-tos? Do I eat a lot when I'm stressed? Do I take it out on other people? Whatever that looks like for you, that's the way. That is the way that you start to uncover some of these things that are so unconscious. They're so deeply buried. Thanks, guys, for joining me today, and I will see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode, I would invite you to subscribe, share it with someone you know, and leave an honest rating or review. You can also connect with me through Instagram at spiritmind.body, through YouTube, or my website. Links to all of these can be found in the show notes below. This work is not easy and requires tremendous self-reflection, grit, and a willingness to be misunderstood, and for that, I honor every single one of you for showing up for your authentic self. Until next time.